E8s. There is something nobody has told you about empaths. Not the version you see romanticized on social media. Not the aesthetic quotes about feeling deeply. I am talking about the real empath. E8s. The one who has been used, betrayed, manipulated, and left empty by people they gave everything to. Radiates. The one who learned to smile while processing a level of pain that most people would not even be able to recognize in themselves. And there is something that kind of person does, something so quiet, D8s, so invisible that the world almost never sees it coming. Something that behavioral psychologists have been documenting for years, and that is only now beginning to be fully understood. D8s. It is called the silent revenge of an empath, and it is nothing like what you think it is. When most people hear the word revenge, they picture confrontation, they picture arguments, public exposure. D8s. Drama, someone finally saying everything they held back. Because that is what popular culture has taught us revenge looks like. But empaths, especially the ones who have matured through genuine pain, D8s, operate in a completely different way. Their revenge makes no noise. It does not arrive in a conversation. Radiates. It does not come in the form of an insult or an accusation or a post designed to humiliate someone publicly. It arrives in the form of silence. It arrives in the form of distance. Radiates. It arrives in the form of a transformation so deep and so complete that the people who tried to destroy them simply no longer recognize who they are looking at. And that, psychologically speaking, radiates is one of the most powerful forms of recovery that exists in human behavior. Before we go further, you need to understand something essential. Empaths do not start this way. Radiates. Nobody is born with perfect boundaries. Nobody enters the world already knowing exactly who deserves access to their inner life. Empaths in their early stages are extraordinarily open people. D8s. They trust quickly. They love deeply. They give without calculating the cost. They explain themselves constantly because they genuinely believe that if the other person just understands their intention, radiates, everything can be worked out. And that openness, that emotional generosity for a period of time makes them vulnerable to a very specific type of person. The person who reads kindness as weakness. Radiates, the person who confuses patience with permission. The person who approaches not to connect but to consume. And this is where the psychology becomes genuinely fascinating, because Chase Hughes, one of the most respected behavioral analysts working today, has documented a pattern he describes as the empath exploitation cycle. It is not a new concept. Yates, but the way it maps onto behavioral science changes everything about how we understand it. According to behavioral analysis, individuals with high empathic sensitivity are systematically more vulnerable to narcissistic and manipulative profiles, not because they are naive, radiates, but because their emotional architecture is literally designed to search for the best in people. Their brain works harder to find positive intention inside negative behavior. And that D8s, which in theory should be a virtue in the wrong environment, becomes a trap. What happens after that trap is what nobody talks about, because after enough damage, after enough betrayals, radiates. After enough moments where you gave everything and received devastation in return, something changes inside an empath. It is not a violent change. It is not a collapse. It is far more subtle than that. D8s. It is like something inside them finally aligns. Like after years of trying to fit into spaces that were never theirs, of reshaping their personality to keep people comfortable. E8s. Of making their inner world smaller so others would feel less threatened, something quietly says not anymore. And that moment, that almost invisible internal shift, is the beginning of the revenge. Radiates. But do not confuse this with bitterness, because bitterness still thinks about the other person. Bitterness still organizes its energy around whoever caused the harm. The silent revenge of an empath is exactly the opposite of that. It is the moment they stop thinking about who hurt them and start thinking about who they are. D8s. And that distinction changes absolutely everything. Because when a mature empath decides to rebuild, they do not do it to prove something to anyone. Radiates. They do it because they finally understand that the only person who deserves all the energy they have been pouring outward is themselves. D8s. Researchers studying behavioral patterns have looked at what happens neurologically when a highly empathic person goes through a deep betrayal and emerges on the other side. And the findings are remarkable. The empath's brain, after sufficient emotional processing, does not become cold. It becomes precise. D8s, the same neural networks that previously processed the pain of others with such intensity, get redirected toward self-protection and self-awareness. It is as if the nervous system says, D8s, I have learned enough about other people's pain. Now it is time to understand my own. And in that moment, the empath begins developing something the manipulators in their life never anticipated them developing: real discernment. Discernment is different from distrust. D8s. Distrust assumes the worst about everyone. Discernment simply evaluates. And when an empath develops genuine discernment, something very particular begins happening in their relationships. E8s. They stop reacting and start observing. They stop explaining themselves and start noticing. E8s. They stop seeking approval and start assessing whether the other person actually deserves access to their world. And the people who used to manipulate them, E8s, the ones who depended on their infinite emotional availability, suddenly find themselves looking at a version of this person they cannot read. A calm version. A version that does not defend itself. Does not attack, does not perform emotions for anyone's benefit, a version that is simply no longer available in the same way, and that destabilizes them completely. Here is something that social psychology research confirms repeatedly and consistently. Individuals with manipulative and narcissistic traits depend on emotional reactivity from the people they target. They need that reactivity. It is their fuel. It is what tells them they still have power. And when the empath stops being reactive, when they begin responding from a place of genuine calm rather than anxiety or need for approval, the manipulator loses traction. They have nothing to hold on to. They cannot provoke the response they need to feel in control. And in that silence, in that calm that the empath has earned through pain, the revenge lives radiates, not because the empath is trying to cause harm, but simply because they can no longer be harmed in the same way. Think about what that actually means for a moment. It's all the energy the manipulator invested in learning the empath's weak points, in studying how to make them feel small, in creating emotional dependency, in slowly eroding their self-confidence, radiates. All that investment becomes worthless because the empath who has done the real work of rebuilding no longer has the same vulnerabilities. Not because they covered them up, radiates, but because they understood them. And when you truly understand the origin of your wounds, when you can actually see how they were created and why you allowed them to persist, radiates. They lose their power over you. They do not disappear entirely, but they no longer control you. And someone who is not controlled by their past is extraordinarily difficult to manipulate in the present. There's a specific behavioral pattern that empaths develop after this transformation that behavioral experts find particularly significant. It is called selective presence. And it is exactly what it sounds like. The empath remains warm, they remain compassionate, they remain capable of deep connection, but that depth is no longer automatically available to everyone. It becomes something earned, not something given by default, and the people who used to have unlimited access to their emotional world suddenly discover there is a distance they cannot cross. Radiates, not because the empath is punishing them, but because the empath simply knows who they are now, and knowing who someone truly is changes entirely how you relate to them. This is critical to understand because so many people misread this transformation. They see the empath becoming quieter, less available, less willing to engage in dramatic dynamics, radiates, and they assume something is wrong. They assume the empath has become cold or depressed or given up on people. But what they are actually witnessing is someone who has stopped wasting emotional energy on dynamics that never gave anything real in return. Radiates. What they are witnessing is someone who has learned the value of their own presence, and when you understand the value of something, you stop giving it away carelessly. Radiates. Studies on emotional recovery in highly sensitive individuals show something that goes directly against the popular narrative. The popular narrative says that healing means becoming more open, more vulnerable, more willing to trust again. But the research tells a different story. Empaths who genuinely heal, who do not just survive betrayal but actually emerge stronger from it, typically become more selective rather than less. They develop what researchers call a more sophisticated emotional architecture. They remain fully capable of deep love and genuine connection. But surrounding that capacity, they develop something they did not have before: standards. And standards, especially the kind that emerge after pain, are often the architecture of self-respect. Radiates. And self-respect, when it develops in someone who previously lived without it, is transformative because suddenly the conversations that used to drain you no longer have access to you. Used to make you feel responsible for their emotions can no longer activate that guilt. The environments that used to absorb you no longer have the same effect because you have learned to recognize the pattern before it pulls you in. And that capacity for pattern recognition radiates. That ability to see the dynamic before being consumed by it is exactly what makes the transformed empath so difficult to manipulate. It is not that they no longer feel. It is that they now feel with clarity. Chase Hughes makes a distinction in his behavioral work that connects directly to this. He talks about the difference between what he calls emotional reactivity and emotional response. Reactivity is automatic, impulsive, driven by patterns from the past. Response is conscious, deliberate, anchored in the present moment. And the majority of psychological manipulation, the majority of tactics that toxic people use to maintain control, depends entirely on the target reacting rather than responding. The manipulator needs that reactivity. And when the empath learns to respond instead of react, when they insert that space between the stimulus and the action, they eliminate the greatest vulnerability they had. And without that vulnerability, the manipulator has no working tools, radiates. But here is the part that matters most, because everything I have described so far could sound like a hardening process, like the empath becomes someone more closed, more guarded, radiates, less capable of feeling, and that would be a completely wrong interpretation. Because what actually happens in the empath who has moved through this transformation is exactly the opposite. Radiates. They become more capable of genuine love, not less, more capable of real connection, not less. But the difference is that capacity is now directed toward the people and places that actually deserve it. And directing love and energy toward where it truly belongs is not hardening. That is wisdom. Think of someone you know who went through a devastating betrayal, a relationship that left them completely empty, a friendship that turned out to be entirely false. Think about who they were before and who they are now if they actually processed that pain properly. Radiates. There is something different about them. They are not the same open and trusting person they were before, but they are not bitter or cynical either. They are something harder to describe. Yates. They are more real. There is something about them that feels authentic in a way they did not have before, as if the process of being broken and rebuilding revealed something essential about who they are. Radiates, and that thing they found in their darkest moment is what they now protect, not out of fear, out of respect for themselves. Idiots. This is the part that popular culture completely fails to understand about transformed empaths. It sees them quieter and assumes they have less to say. Deates. It sees them less available and assumes they have less love to give. It sees them more selective and assumes they have become arrogant. Deates. But what is actually happening is that they have stopped confusing display with value. They have stopped believing they need to constantly demonstrate who they are to be considered valid. Deates. They have arrived at a place where they know exactly who they are, and that certainty requires no audience. There is fascinating research on what psychologists call stable identity under social pressure. Radiates. Individuals who have developed this kind of identity, the ones who do not need external validation to maintain a clear sense of themselves, are significantly more resistant to manipulation. Adiates. More resilient to gaslighting, more capable of holding boundaries under pressure, and notably more difficult to control through fear of loss or fear of rejection. Deates. Because two of the most powerful tools that manipulators use are precisely those two things: the fear of losing the relationship and the fear of being rejected. Adiates. And when someone has already lost what they valued most and survived it, when they have already been rejected by people who claimed to love them and still stood up, those tools simply stop working. The manipulator arrives with their full arsenal and discovers it has no power. That is the silent revenge. It is not a plan. It is not a calculated strategy designed to cause suffering in return. Deates. It is the natural result of someone who decided to genuinely heal. It is what happens when an empath stops trying to change the people who hurt them and starts changing themselves. Radiates. When they stop asking why they were treated that way and start asking what pattern in themselves allowed it to happen. That question, that honest and courageous question, idiots, is the one that changes everything. Because it does not look for blame outside. It looks for understanding inside. And understanding, when it arrives, genuinely liberates. Idiots. Now I want to talk about something that almost nobody mentions when discussing transformed empaths. There is a specific moment in this process that is particularly powerful and particularly quiet. It is the moment the empath stops waiting for an apology, because for a long time, often without even being consciously aware of it, radiates. The empath has been waiting for the person who hurt them to acknowledge what they did, waiting for that moment of clarity, that conversation where everything is recognized and validated. Radiates. And that waiting, that invisible waiting, keeps them connected to the past. It keeps them in a relationship with someone who no longer deserves space in their present. Yates. Because as long as you are waiting for someone to give you the apology they owe you, that person still has power over your emotional state. And the day the empath says, "I do not need that apology," radiates. Not because the person does not owe it, but because my peace no longer depends on receiving it. Something breaks. Not in the empath, in the chain that kept them attached to what was. And that break, Yates, that quiet decision to stop waiting for validation from someone incapable of giving it, is one of the most profound acts of self-respect a human being can perform. Yates. And it shifts the energy of the entire dynamic in a way that the other person, even if they never consciously understand it, always feels. Radiates, because there is something in human behavior that experts in nonverbal communication and behavioral psychology have documented extensively. People feel when they have lost influence over someone. Radiates. Even when they cannot articulate exactly what changed. They sense the difference between someone who is emotionally available to be affected by them and someone who is no longer. Deates. And when the manipulator or the toxic person feels that loss of influence, they often try to recover it. They return with a new version of themselves. They offer what they never offered before. Yates. They suddenly become more considerate, more attentive, more interested. And this can be deeply confusing for someone still in the middle of healing. Yates. Because part of them wants to believe the change is real. But the transformed empath, the one who has done the genuine work of understanding themselves, recognizes this pattern. Radiates. Not because they are suspicious by default, but because they have learned to evaluate behavior rather than declared intention. It radiates. And there is an enormous difference between what someone says they are doing and what they are actually doing consistently over time. The mature empath no longer judges by words, they judge by patterns. And patterns do not lie. This ability to read behavioral patterns rather than being swept away by emotional declarations is one of the most powerful skills the empath develops after their transformation. idiots, and it is fascinating because it is exactly the skill that Chase Hughes teaches in his behavioral profiling work with professionals in intelligence and negotiation. Idiots. The ability to separate what someone says from what someone does. The ability to observe the pattern across time rather than reacting to the individual moment. Idiots. And when an empath develops this capacity naturally through lived experience rather than theory, they become someone extraordinarily difficult to deceive. Idiots. And here we arrive at the core of everything I have been building toward. The silent revenge of an empath is not making the other person suffer. It is not proving they were wrong. It is not even visible success, though that sometimes follows. The silent revenge is simply this: becoming someone who can no longer be hurt in the same way. D8s. Flourishing in the silence that used to feel like emptiness. Building a life that does not require the approval of the people who tried to dismantle it. Radiates. Developing a peace so genuine and so deep that it cannot be faked and cannot be purchased. And live in that peace without announcing it, without displaying it, without turning it into content for public consumption. Because the silent revenge is silent for a reason. It needs no audience. It needs no recognition. E8s. The empath who has arrived at this place does not need the world to know they won. Does not need the person who hurt them to witness how well they are doing. They are well for themselves, and that to exist fully without needing witnesses is the most complete form of freedom that exists. And I want you to finish with this held somewhere deep inside you. D8s. If you are someone who has been through a betrayal you thought was unsurvivable, if you are someone who gave everything and received devastation in return, radiates. If you are someone who was told you were too sensitive, too intense, too much of everything, I want you to know something true. That level of sensitivity that made you vulnerable is not your flaw. It is your most extraordinary capacity pointed in the wrong direction. Because the same depth with which you felt the pain is the same depth with which you can feel the recovery. Radiates. The same intensity with which you loved someone who did not deserve it is the same intensity with which you can learn to love yourself. And when that happens, when that energy that was directed outward finally comes home, something extraordinary begins to grow. It is not revenge in the traditional sense. It is something more powerful than that. It is living proof that what they tried to break did not break, that what they tried to silence found a deeper voice than it had before. Radiates. That what they tried to make small grew in the dark in ways neither they nor you could have imagined possible. And that silent transformation, that flower that grew in the place where someone planted destruction, that is the empath's revenge. And nobody, absolutely nobody, can ever take it from you.